Hey there. Welcome back to these conversations with no one, where I attempt to share my experience of living in a state of somewhat non-identification with my character and duality. This is the third conversation where I share stories from and about my character. And this is part 2 of the confrontations with narcissists. So there's a part of me right now that really feels like I've fallen off the wagon, as it were, and relapsed a bit, temporarily losing my sense of equanimity to give in to the temptations of stories and ego identification. My character gorged himself for a bit in being right and reveled in having an emotionally cathartic battle of wills that was completely unnecessary and unhelpful to anyone. I have to admit it felt good at the time, but the come down and hangover afterward left me humbly accepting there are still some unresolved issues lurking at my core. So once again, this story is a long one and includes a detailed and unnecessary personal drama that the casual listener might just want to skip. So in part 1, I told the story of how I met a young woman who has since become family to me, and came to realize that a friend of mine had some problematic behavioral issues and displayed narcissistic tendencies. And I use the language of narcissist and narcissism not as a label or diagnosis of someone who's this or that, but only to describe the ways they behave. And for me, that's characterized as malicious storytelling for the purpose of building up the storyteller and discrediting others. And since this is closely related to how we all experience what the brain tells us is real, and how we all make enormous leaps of self-justification just as a normal part of living our daily lives, there isn't any judgment here. Just observation, experience of unbalance. Now, I can usually deal with all the expressions of this dynamics with a great deal of patience and acceptance. But it does grate on me when there's no room for anyone else's story but the storyteller. There's no room for anyone else's stories to have validation. There seems to be absolutely no purpose to interacting with these people on a deeper level. So I usually interact with people like this with a bit of space, trying not to engage in the problematic areas while interacting in ways that are valuable to both of us. But as soon as my patience runs out, my equanimity runs out, when the actions of someone exhibiting narcissistic behavior threatens to cause suffering in those that I care about, those around me. So we skip ahead about 4 years from the story in part 1 to about 6 weeks ago or so. And for me, those 4 years were deeply transformative as my non-identification deepened during that time into the current state I'm experiencing. If I had tried to create these conversations then, I probably would have been a bit preachy, as I was still really engaged with egoic expression. And during the 4 years or so between that story and this one, I'd had several occasions to help my young friend out of problematic situations that she'd created for herself as she attempted to find her way. And as I explained before, I find myself with a large capacity to help people who are doing the inner work, regardless of how messy their external exploration of the world is. This, to me, is the chaotic nature of becoming, and shouldn't be confused with enabling a person by validating unhelpful stories. It's sort of a fine line there, but now because I live in a converted shuttle bus and have very few material resources, most of the help I can give anyone is only non-judgmental support. And that's good because it keeps me from trying to save someone materially at the expense of helping them work on themselves. But my bus is capable of helping move someone physically and their belongings, and can also be a temporary, if crowded, emergency place to stay. And this is how I was able to help my young friend on several occasions in the past. So about 2 months ago, she called me from Seattle, and she was having a complete meltdown because she discovered her live-in boyfriend of 6 months had been lying to her. He had addiction and control issues that became completely unmanageable after she realized he wasn't being honest about it to him at all. And the level of betrayal she was experiencing was emotionally breaking her, because it was also the most vulnerable she had been in a relationship, the most she had given in a relationship, probably in her entire life. So she needed to leave immediately for her own mental health. So I packed up my bus, drove 2.5 hours to Seattle, loaded it up with all her belongings, and turned around and drove straight back down. I was really encouraging her to come give Portland a second chance, as she'd only lived here during the pandemic. And I was absolutely certain that she would thrive in this environment, more so in Seattle. And I also admit that my motives probably tainted by wanting to have another friend here who's great at creating social opportunities and could bring some energy to my life. But none of that would have been possible without me having a place for her to land, besides camping on the street somewhere. My bus is really comfortable, but having electricity and facilities to use, especially when there's 2 people, was kind of essential. And out of my situations here in Portland, only one of them seemed like it could easily accommodate a bit of short-term chaos. My 3 situations with friends I have here who let me park outside of or on their property, plug into their electricity. So this friend of this property was when I'd helped build a fence around to make a compound with a giant RV structure. It's owned by a friend of mine who was camped in her own backyard in an RV while she rented out her house for income. And I'd been parking there for a few months while I was doing paid work on the property. So having another person stay with me for a few weeks didn't seem like it would be much of a problem. In hindsight, I can't believe I thought bringing these 2 people together would end well. The owner of the property, my host, was an older woman my age who I'd known for about 4 or 5 years, a friend of a friend from my social circle. I met her when she was married and had a driveway I could live in exchange for some hard labor she needed help with around her house and garden. She was a hands-on DIYer, but with physical limitations, so having an extra set of hands was very helpful for her. I stayed there and helped her out for about a year before moving on. And during that time, I got to know her as a good-hearted, well-meaning person who also had some emotional and personality issues. I didn't ever get to know her very well then, though, because she was extremely closed off to different perspectives, and so I stopped sharing mine, which kept our connection just on the surface. And soon after I left, she began having serious relationship issues that led to her asking for a divorce and moving out. And during that time, I witnessed, the depth of her malicious storytelling. It was a very long and messy divorce, mostly because that's the way she wanted it. To be more specific, it became obvious she never actually wanted a divorce and felt betrayed and abandoned by her husband's agreement to one. It turned out if he wanted out, then she'd make sure he suffered for it. It was really hard to watch, and I even had to act as a mediator at one point between the two. But it was really none of my business, so I was able to remove myself from the ongoing drama. And at some point, this woman ended up buying an RV and traveling back and forth across the country on her own. During that time, she seemed to have worked through a bunch of her issues and seemed to have found some balance. She finalized the divorce, landed in Portland, where she bought a house that could provide stability for her as well as some income. And it was here that I reconnected with our mutual friend who connected me with her again. And once again, she needed help getting her property built up to speed. I was really hesitant at first to get involved with her again, but also willing to get to know who she currently was rather than hold her past self against her. And in the end, we ended up getting along well enough. I was happy to stay there indefinitely. There was space, some work now and again, some community, and eventually a new friend who rented out the house and needed my help as a puppy sitter. The situation lasted a very comfortable few months, possibly too comfortable. It was just sort of providing just enough income to be able to do social things out and about in the city, but not enough to make further extra adventures practical. I didn't mind the slow-paced routine and lack of excitement. It was a great balance of getting some social interaction with minimum effort, while also being able to provide value to two people. Yeah. So when my friend from Seattle needed help and some support to start over, I saw that this would be a great place for her to find support from two women with different but relevant life experience to share. My host and her tenant had both met her and liked her very much, and there'd even been talk of my friend renting the second bedroom in the house, so on the surface it seemed absolutely perfect. At least that was the story I sold myself and worked tirelessly to have it come about. It's how I wanted the story to work out for my own convenience, so I conveniently compartmentalized all the red flags. It stuns me how much I was able to dupe myself after years of deconstructing my stories, and I'm thankful for having my lack of awareness brought to my attention in a way I couldn't ignore it. During the time I worked and stayed on my host's property, he was always a heavy drinker and emotionally processed everything as a victim. Everything was somebody else's fault. The few deeper conversations we had always ended up with her revisiting and retelling past dramas, bursting into tears, and discounting any perspectives except for the ones she was already invested in. And during that time, all I could really do was hold some space for her feelings and offer authentic support when and where I could, but I mostly gave her space to experience her own narrative without judgment or desire to help her or point out where she was wrong. And this was how I navigated our connection for several months. But my experience of her behavior changed the moment I brought my friend into the situation. My host's attempt to manipulate my perspective or control my narrative were never a threat to how I was experiencing life. But it was obvious they were a threat to a young, inexperienced woman in a vulnerable place. What followed was a chaotic few weeks of intense bonding between the two women. They got on like a house on fire at first and loved each other to death. And then there's the corresponding huge falling out due to some strange controlling behavior from my host. And during that time, my friend moved out, couch surfed with a friend of hers. When the couch surfing didn't work out, my friend reconciled with my host, and a new agreement was made to allow my friend to actually pitch a tent in the compound, with the understanding that it was only for as long as it took for her to save money to move into her own place. And for about a week or two, it was actually a really wonderful arrangement. My friend got an interview for a second job and found a cheap room to rent in a group house occupied by two other friends of mine. Our host went out of town for a week, leaving us to enjoy the space. The night our host was returning from her trip was the night before my friend's big interview and us moving her to a new home. So on that night, our host communicated her flight was delayed and she would be getting home at 2:30 in the morning. Unfortunate, but not a big deal for us. Unfortunately, it turned out a bit different. During her long travel, our host had been drinking a lot. And when she got home at 2:30 in the morning, she made the questionable choice to invite her Lyft driver, someone she'd known for about 15 minutes, home with her to have more drinks and loud conversation. Now, I didn't care what choices she made for herself. Those were her business and not my place to even have an opinion about it. I don't really judge her for, I don't judge anybody for risky life choices, because some of the best things happen when we take risks like that. But she invited this unknown person into the safe, locked area, while my friend was in a tent 2 feet away, listening to them partying in the RV. My friend eventually came to sleep in the safety of my bus, but then we were woken soon after the sun came up by loud arguing, talking about the police, this man slamming the door as he stormed away to his car. And at that point, it was obvious that our host's behavior put us all at risk. My friend was a bit shaken and angry, while I had suddenly become very concerned about the situation. And if this could happen, what other things could happen? But we both focused on the important events of the day ahead, the interview and the move. After all, it's the day we're moving out, so long-term concerns weren't necessary. I even planned to park my bus near the home that my friend was moving into for a couple days to let the whole situation back at the compound cool off and decide for myself what I wanted to do next. But then our host began reaching out to me, expressing her displeasure at our displeasure of her actions. And this is where I lost my magnanimity. She explained how she was the victim of my friend's intolerance and began to berate me about all the ways my friend, and I by extension, had treated her extremely unfairly, and then abandoned her after everything she had done for us. She took no personal responsibility at all for her actions or expressed any awareness that the feelings we were having about the situation were valid. And then she began escalating her language into wild accusations. And I was well and truly hooked into the story by this time. Of course, I was running on almost no sleep and trying to focus on extremely important material events that could see my friend into a secure place with her new life. So I gave in to temptation and I stopped being kind. I told her the truth about how I felt about everything. I shared my perspective bluntly and honestly, knowing it would not go down well. Of course, that just made her defensive reactions keep escalating, so I kept being less kind and more blunt. While trying to stay as rational as I could, I started spelling things out like I would to a child, knowing the things I said would hurt her to hear, and somewhere deep, hoping it might trigger some self-reflection. But it was obvious that wasn't going to happen, and that instead I had decided to fight with her, simply rather than letting her have her stories. I'm happy to say my friend got the second job and we got her moved out through all this emotional chaos. I think I went through that in the video titled Character Development. But I feel a little guilty that the whole thing was really cathartic. And having got it out of my system, I felt a certain amount of relief and satisfaction. But I also knew I'd indulged my ego and not acted from a place of authenticity. And the mere fact that I had all this pent-up frustration means that my methods for navigating this challenging situation included a certain amount of spiritual and or emotional bypassing. I had not managed to be my authentic self while interacting in this dynamic, choosing to suppress my feelings to avoid conflict, possibly. And that's given me a lot to examine. I'm grateful for what is exposed about my current story and stories I might continue to create. I hope to learn how to authentically express myself without creating conflict in the future. I'm also very aware that somehow I recreated the same traumatic narcissist story we lived through several years earlier, and I didn't even notice it while it was happening. So now I'm in a place where I'll let my subconscious process all of this while I do some ongoing soul searching and try to unpack, understand all the layers of experience here. As I shared a couple videos ago, life is now more interesting and fulfilling than it has been in years, and I'm enjoying these moments of opportunity for what they are. But the wake-up call was enough that I'm paying closer attention now to my stories and my character's behavior. And again, it seems to come down to all the times I didn't say something because I felt like it wasn't my place to say anything. And yet this was apparently causing some built-up frustrations that I needed to express or let out at some point when push came to shove. So I'm sure there's got to be the way that I can communicate without engaging in the story. So I'm going to have to think about that one. Once again, I'm interested in any feedback you folks have to share, and I guess look forward to having more conversations as I work through this. So thanks for listening. Thanks for joining me here. And I hope you have a great day. Take care.